Acceptance isn't about racism is here and we just have to deal with it. That's different. I'm accepting that we're in this moment now, that these things have happened. I'm not going to look away. I'm going to stand in it, knowing that I have the full capacity to see myself through to the other side.
Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Jones-Bell. I'm Headspace's Chief Strategy and Science Officer. And with me today is Dr. Wizdom Powell. Dr. Powell is a trained population health disparities research scientist and clinical psychologist.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's a real privilege to be here.
We're having this conversation today because of these striking inequities in health outcomes between racial and ethnic groups in the United States.
So Dr. Powell, you are a luminary in helping create awareness about how the intersection of race, masculinity, health beliefs, and behaviors are understood and addressed by psychologists and health professionals. Can you tell us how you got into this work?
I think I've shared this story before of how my grandfather, who was a Korean War veteran, single father of 9 children, and just this incredible force of nature, actually passed away prematurely from a cancer that was preventable in his early 50s. Losing him made it clear to me that when men and boys perish too quickly from conditions that we can prevent, the entire family suffers. And not just a family that is present and alive then, but the family that is to come. It was that loss that really drove me to really want to create a world where everyone has the fullest opportunity to live their healthiest lives. So, most of the times when we think about racism operating, we think about the kind of racism that we can see, touch, and feel. And what I've come to understand about the way that racism impacts health systems is that it operates in the fibers, right? So when I talk about racism in health systems, I'm talking about everything from how physicians negotiate power to actually how frontline staff and other folks within health systems treat BIPOC individuals when they show up.
A lot of your work also focuses specifically on health inequities of Black men. Can you define the term gender paradox and how this relates to your work?
There are a couple of gender paradoxes that I focus in on in my work. The first is the oft-cited gender paradox in mental health, where we see boys and men being less likely to be diagnosed with clinical depression, but also having some of the highest rates of suicide completion in our nation. That to me is paradoxical. The important thing to remember when we think about male disparities in mental health, we have to also understand that men and boys are socialized to deny bodily pain. They are taught to soldier on, to man up, to walk it off whenever they're experiencing emotional pain. And so that creates this habitual kind of emotion suppression that wreaks havoc on the body and mind over time. Some of the disparities we're observing are rooted in disproportionate access to social and healthcare resources.
I'm curious for you to explore the connection between that and what you call racial trauma. How is racial trauma the same or different from what we think of as trauma in other contexts?
I like to talk about it as you remember the childhood game Whack-A-Mole? You hit it one place and then it pops up in another. That's what happens when people sort of habitually suppress really, strong and impactful emotional experiences. So when we're talking about racial trauma, we are really talking about injuries to the self that are usually brought about by exposure to racialized violence, microaggressions, microassaults, and microinvalidation. And so racial trauma can actually resonate with traditional post-traumatic stress disorder or traumas that we might see in other contexts. But we don't have a formal recognition of racism as being potentially traumatizing, and yet we know it is. In fact, recent data suggests that we don't even have to be directly impacted. So we have this vicarious trauma that we're all being exposed to now as a result also, of social media and the ready access that we now have to the images of people being violated. So racial trauma actually can produce the same kinds of outcomes that we see in traditional forms of trauma.
I'm curious, if we're not asking about experiences of racism, what are we missing? It seems like those aren't questions we've been trained to ask in healthcare.
And here's the reason, because we know that there is a disproportionate number of Black men in our country who are diagnosed with schizophrenia. Many of them probably legitimately are. But I can't help but wonder about the young man who might show up in a clinician's office talking about racism and about the fact that he feels that he's being watched or people are subjecting him to more surveillance. I wonder if we are not listening with the right kind of third ear to those experiences because we haven't legitimized them. One thing we know about healing from any trauma is that you have to be able to name and claim the pain. And so if you're doing a psychological assessment of someone who has been exposed to racism, the question to be asking is not, is racism operating here, but how is it? That if you don't really honor that, then how can you treat it?
It sounds like, what you're calling for is really an empathy exercise of how might we repair this trust and design experiences of help seeking that actually are conducive to healing.
And here's the thing, Megan, when we do that, not only will Black, Indigenous, and people of color be better served, but we all will.
When someone starts recovering from this racial trauma, what is the process of recovery like?
People typically need support, like with any other anxiety disorder, with gaining more sense of emotional control. Really understanding, first of all, what is happening physiologically to them. We actually need to get more people into spaces where they can actually show up and disclose that pain. And then we go about the treatment of racial trauma in many of the ways that I, as a trauma psychologist, would treat. So helping people be able to determine, what that sense of anxiety feels like in the body, to actually help them understand that those traumas don't define them. People really want to come back to the self, the highest version of the self that they had before trauma came in and disrupted their homeostatic balance. And so treating people who are exposed to racial trauma is about reminding them of that and helping them reconstitute the self.
For people who are listening who may have experienced trauma, what do you recommend they do and as they think about taking steps towards healing?
So the first step is to breathe. I would say breathe, baby, breathe, because we all have to be able to catch our collectively stolen breaths. And then the second is to honor the pain and the hit emotionally that you've taken and not convince yourself that somehow you don't have a right to those emotions. The other thing is to reach out to someone that you trust. Talk to a minister, a friend, a colleague, someone you trust. And then the third step is really to know that there is going to be a different version of you waiting on the other side of this. So I just want people to know that, even when you see people like me who are, preaching, if you will, to the choir, know that I am in the choir. I have experienced those things, and many of us have. And so we offer up ourselves in this work because we know how challenging it can be and how empowering it can be for those who are receiving support to know that there is a different part of you waiting on the other side.
Well, Dr. Powell, that's one thing that really stands out to me about you is that you show us this possibility of taking something that is the source of suffering and pain and actually creating more capacity for connection with others.
The traumas that I experience and the traumas that many of us experience can actually open a portal to more growth. And I think if you look at Black and Indigenous and people of color and how they have displayed tremendous resilience over generations, we show up in society ready to serve, vote, participate, in making America what it is, should tell you something about people's desire to heal and grow and thrive.
When you think about, that journey from trauma to, resilience as you've described it, we at Headspace think about meditation and mindfulness as really being this combination of awareness and compassion, but acceptance of your present moment experience is a key part of that. Can you help us understand how you think about acceptance?
Acceptance isn't about forgiveness. It's about standing in the moment and honoring that everything that has happened in your life has brought you to this moment for whatever reason, and that to actually move forward, you have to be willing to stand in what is the here and now. It doesn't mean that you have to say, I accept that racism is here and we'll just have to deal with it. No, that's different. It's I'm accepting that we're in this moment now, that these things have happened. I'm not going to look away. I'm going to stand in it, knowing that I have the full capacity to see myself through to the other side.
When you are able to accept these are your present circumstances, it really does allow you to stop that tug of war with yourself of, I want them to be different. You can still want them to be different.
Right. There's an adage that says, if you don't do the healing work now, then your children and their children's children will have to. And that I know we will be condemned for. The syndemics of COVID-19 and racism have actually created, this potent mix. But it's not as if we haven't been here before. And it's not as if racism is new. And we know that we haven't done the work. So I'm saying that, we have an opportunity now, this watershed moment, to do the critical anti-racism work that we have not done for generations.
And on that note, what can we collectively do to take steps in that direction?
So there's a lot of work that is happening now as a result of our collective reaction to racialized violence. And that has been inspiring. And what I hope is that we keep going. The challenge is that we often get here, but without a plan and without a commitment to actually take on the tough work of integrating and centralizing that agenda, we will lose this moment. And so right now, what we have to do is dig our heels in and then do the tough work of undoing all the subtle and not so subtle ways that racism operates there. And that will take time, resources, and sustained commitment. But when we do that together, we will all be radically healed.
Dr. Powell, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. This is just incredible wisdom that you've shared.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you and to the listeners. And I wish everyone listening health and happiness for sure.